Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. As we wrap up these 3 weeks of looking at stories in the Bible where people gave thanks and praise to God, sometimes in surprising circumstances, we remember that St. Paul urged us in Thessalonians to give thanks in all circumstances. For our last day on this topic together, I want to focus on one more time when Jesus gave thanks. And once again, because of the events that follow, we may have passed right by it and never really noticed. Today, I want us to look at Jesus at the Last Supper. And this is where that give thanks in all circumstances comes back into play. Let me remind you about when this happens. Jesus is in Jerusalem, the headquarters of those who opposed him and were seeking his life. All week long he had been caught up in one controversy after another, overturning tables in the temple, challenges with the priests who were seeking to trap him, questions about taxes and authority, and much more. And behind the scenes that the disciples didn't know, but Jesus knew, one of his own followers, Judas, was plotting to betray him. Nevertheless, when the Passover came, Jesus gathered with his followers to remember the salvation and deliverance God had given the people. First, Jesus washed the disciples' feet as a sign that the way of the Christian life is one of service and humility. And then, during the meal of salvation, Jesus gave us a new meal to remember the new salvation God was working in him. He took bread, and then the Bible clearly tells us he gave thanks. He gave thanks. In the midst of all this stress and knowing what was to come that night and the horrible death he was to die the very next day, he gave thanks. You see, even in the face of dire trouble, Jesus knew and Jesus taught us that God is still with us, and God is still to be praised. God is still to receive our gratitude and thanks. We sometimes forget to give God thanks and praise when things are good, maybe even especially when things are good. But Jesus gave thanks even when faced with more than any of us can take. He took bread and gave thanks. He took wine and gave thanks. He gave it to us, his own body and blood, our new meal of salvation. Maybe you've never noticed, but in our worship service, this part is called the Great Thanksgiving. Communion is often called the Eucharist, which is a Greek word for thanksgiving. Maybe this Thanksgiving holiday, we can give thanks to God not just for our blessings, but also for God's grace, mercy, and love. May our lives become thanksgiving. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.